The year is 1819, and the entire world runs on oil. Not the crude black gold of Texas or Arabia, but the pale, clean-burning oil rendered from the colossal head of the sperm whale. And the capital of this global, brutal industry, the Silicon Valley of its age, was a lonely, sandy, wind-swept island 12 miles off the coast of Massachusetts, Nantucket. On Nantucket, men didn't dream of planting crops or building factories. They dreamed of blubber. Every single aspect of life was dictated by the hunt. The docks, thick with the stench of whale residue and tar, pulse with a relentless, arrogant energy. Fortunes were made and lost between one sunset and the next. Whale oil lit the streets of London, lubricated the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, and made the owners of Nantucket the richest men per capita in the entire young American Republic. But this wealth came at a savage, almost impossible cost: separation, danger, and a relentless moral calculus. A whaling voyage was not a trip. It was a voluntary exile of 3, 4, or even 5 years. Every man who signed the articles of a whaler was signing a contract with the unknown. The ship at the center of this tragedy was the Essex, a sleek, two-masted whaler known for its speed and its luck. She was a fast-sailing brig about 87 feet long, designed to cut across the waves and endure the fury of the Southern Ocean. Her crew of 20 men was a microcosm of Nantucket ambition, divided into 2 distinct, powerful personalities. Captain George Pollard, Jr., the burden of youth. George Pollard, Jr. was only 29 years old, and this was his first command. A whaler since his youth, he had inherited the vessel from an older, more successful family member. This voyage was meant to be his coronation, the moment he stepped out of his relative's shadow and claimed his own fortune. But underneath the new captain's greatcoat and the veneer of authority was a nervous, almost painfully sensitive man. He was a good navigator and a decent seaman, but he lacked the raw iron temperament required to command men and the ocean for years on end. His inexperience, coupled with the pressure of the island's relentless expectations, was a hidden leak in the ship's hull long before they left the harbor. First Mate Owen Chase, the seaman's pride. Owen Chase, at 23, was the true natural sailor aboard the Essex. A man of taut muscle, sharp eyes, and ruthless efficiency, Chase was the perfect first mate, cold, pragmatic, and technically brilliant. If the captain was burdened by emotional ties and inexperience, Chase was unburdened by anything but his professional pride. Chase was a superb harpooner and a fearless boat commander. He should have been the captain, and he knew it. This dynamic, the inexperienced captain and the superior first mate, created an undercurrent of tension and suppressed rivalry that would only intensify when the real crisis struck. The omen and the decision. The Essex was fully stocked with 70 tons of salt and provisions, enough to last 2 years. She also carried 3 whaleboats, small, fragile vessels launched from the deck during a hunt, and the necessary heavy gear, harpoons, lances, and the dreaded mincing knives used for butchering the colossal animals. But before they even passed the Nantucket bar, an unnerving incident occurred. A sudden squall hit, and a strong gust of wind dismasted the Essex, snapping one of her top masts. This was no trivial accident. It was an omen. Superstitious sailors muttered about bad luck, a curse. Pollard, desperate to make his first command a success, refused to turn back. They quickly replaced the mast and sailed on, dismissing the incident as a rough start. This was the first of many subtle, prideful mistakes they would make. On August 12, 1819, the Essex sailed out of Nantucket Harbor and turned south. They had signed on for a 2.5-year journey, bound not just for the Atlantic, but for the offshore ground, the remote, largely uncharted waters of the South Pacific, far west of the traditional hunting grounds of the Peruvian coast. They were sailing into the deepest isolation the world offered. The first year was a punishing, monotonous success. They weathered the storms of the South Atlantic, rounded the treacherous Cape Horn, a graveyard for ships,
and finally broke into the enormous expanse of the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean, to a whaler, was less an ocean and more a boundless liquid desert. Weeks bled into months of empty horizon. The primary human comfort was the sudden, savage burst of adrenaline during a sperm whale sighting, the blast of vapor, known as a blow, that marked a fortune floating on the surface. In the Pacific, the Essex began to make its money. The routine was fixed and violent. Lowering the boats, the whaleboats were dropped and the chase began. The sinking iron. The harpooner rowed to within feet of the massive target and plunged the iron harpoon into its flesh. The Nantucket sleigh ride. The wounded whale would take off, dragging the boat at terrifying speeds, often up to 20 knots, a ride that could last for hours. The kill. The final, dangerous stage where the boat was pulled alongside the exhausted whale and the boat commander drove a long, sharp lance into its lungs or heart, drowning the behemoth in its own blood. By the beginning of 1820, the Essex had taken about 800 barrels of oil. They were profitable. They could have turned for home, a modest success. But the ambition of Captain Pollard and the avarice of the ship's owners were vast. There was a rumor circulating among the ships in the Pacific, a fabulous new hunting ground, the offshore ground. It was said to be a place teeming with whales, far from the overhunted coasts. It was an oceanic El Dorado. To reach it, they would have to sail 2,000 miles further west, deep into the South Pacific, beyond 110 degrees longitude, where no other American whaler had dared to go. It was a perilous, isolated venture, sailing away from every known current and safety net. They chose greed over caution. The empty hold and the fire. Before they reached the promised land, they met their second piece of bad luck, this time a blunder of human error. On a mild day in September 1820, anchored near the coast of Ecuador, a young sailor named Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy and a chronicler of the tragedy, was tasked with retrieving candles from the lazarette. He did so with a lit candle, accidentally knocking the flame into a barrel of dry rubbish. The lower decks erupted in flames. The fire was contained, but the damage was extensive, forcing the crew to burn through some of their precious wood and resources. They extinguished the blaze, but the event was another jolt of fear. Two incidents, the broken mast and the fire, before they even reached the distant hunting grounds. Still, they pushed on. They reached the offshore ground and found that the rumors were gloriously, terrifyingly true. The area was swarming with whales. It was a jackpot. They were in the process of hauling a dead whale back to the ship, their minds focused entirely on the rendering process and the barrels of fortune, when the ocean exacted its vengeance.
The date was November 20, 1820. The sun was high, the water calm. They were nearly 10 days' sail past the known cruising grounds, 2,000 miles from the nearest land. At about 8 a.m., the masthead lookout shouted the familiar cry, "There she blows! A school of sperm whales!" 3 whaleboats were lowered immediately. Captain Pollard's boat and the second mate's boat set off to chase the main school. Owen Chase, the first mate, took his boat and another crew toward a different, smaller group of whales. It was a standard, glorious morning of the hunt. The first shock. Chase's boat was quickly disabled by a flick of a whale's tail, forcing the men to return to the Essex for repairs. As they worked on the hull, the ship drifted lazily. Chase looked out at the ocean, scanning for the rest of the crew, when he saw it. A whale of unimaginable size, surfacing just a few hundred yards off the port bow. It was a monstrous bull, easily 85 feet long, far larger and more scarred than any whale Chase had ever encountered. It looked less like an animal and more like a scarred leviathan of mythology. The great whale lay motionless for a moment, then began to move with purpose. It was not diving to flee. It was swimming directly toward the Essex. "He's making for the ship!" Chase screamed. The sailors on board were frozen in terror. The whale submerged and then, with devastating, calculated speed, slammed its head into the port side of the Essex's bow. The impact was bone-shattering, a sound like a cannon going off, followed by the gruesome, splintering shriek of timber. The shock threw men to the deck. The ship shuddered violently, then hesitated. Chase, clutching the broken gunwale, ran to the rail. The whale had surfaced just off the starboard, breathing heavily, its body turning in the water as if dazed. The Essex was already taking on water. The second charge. But the whale was not retreating. It circled the ship, seeming to observe the damage, its huge head and eye focused with unnerving intelligence on the hull. "He's gonna come again!" Chase yelled. "Brace yourselves!" The remaining men watched in paralyzing fear. The whale lowered its head and began swimming toward the Essex at a terrifying speed, estimated by Chase at 6 knots. It hit the ship in the same spot, not with the accidental force of a panicked animal, but with the deliberate, malicious force of a battering ram. The second blow was final. The collision utterly shattered the bow. Seams burst open with sickening finality, and a torrent of icy seawater exploded into the forepeak. The ship was fatally wounded. Chase looked up and saw the whale swim past, disappearing into the vast Pacific, its vengeance complete. Abandoned ship. The Essex settled, listing rapidly to one side. The chaos was instantaneous. "The ship is sinking!" Chase roared, his pragmatism finally cutting through the paralyzing terror. He oversaw the desperate scramble. They had minutes, perhaps 10, before the Essex was lost to the deep. They lowered the remaining whaleboats, which were never designed to hold 20 men and supplies for an ocean voyage. Chase, thinking clearly amid the mayhem, managed to grab 2 quadrants, 2 nautical almanacs, a few spare ropes, and a meager supply of hardtack and fresh water. The ship settled deeper, the deck now submerged. The men were in the water, scrambling into the 3 tiny boats, their hopes sinking with the vessel. As the Essex slipped under the surface, the 2 other whaleboats, commanded by Captain Pollard, arrived on the scene. He could only stare horrified at the spot where his brand-new, valuable ship had been floating just an hour before. "My God, Mr. Chase," Pollard whispered, seeing the devastation. "What has happened?" Owen Chase, his face covered in soot and spray, had only one word: a whale. 20 men, separated by a quarter-mile of ocean, now huddled in 3 small, open boats, 25 feet long and 5 feet wide, facing the endless, empty horizon. They were 2,000 miles from South America, 3,000 miles from the Marquesas, and 10,000 miles from home. Their voyage had just begun.
The 3 tiny boats, Captain Pollard's, First Mate Owen Chase's, and Second Mate Matthew Joy's, drifted together near the wreckage, waiting for the Essex to disappear entirely. When the last bubble rose and the ship was gone, the silence was deafening, broken only by the lapping of the Pacific and the muffled despair of 20 men. Their inventory was catastrophic. They had managed to salvage 2 quadrants and 2 nautical almanacs, vital for navigation, a few bags of hardtack biscuits, and 9 barrels of fresh water. But the boats were so small that they sat dangerously low in the water. Captain Pollard called the 3 boats together to discuss their impossible dilemma. They were about 2,000 miles west of the Galapagos and the nearest known landmass, South America. The men in the boats, desperate for a quick solution, pleaded to sail west to the closest Polynesian islands, But the leadership knew the risk. Those islands were often inhabited by hostile tribes, and they had limited charts for that route. Owen Chase, ever the pragmatist, argued the only sensible solution was to try for South America, a known quantity, even if it was a punishing distance. Pollard, influenced by old rumors of a cannibalistic coast on the continent's southern tip, compromised. They would sail southeast, aiming for an indirect, safer course to avoid the equatorial currents and the rumored coast. It was a fatal decision. The route they chose was longer, more indirect, and took them into the open sea, where rescue was an impossibility. They rationed the meager supplies immediately. 6 ounces of water and 1 hardtack biscuit per man per day. The men looked at the endless, empty ocean and understood the truth. They had enough to last maybe 2 weeks at best, and they had thousands of miles to cover. Chapter 5. Sunstroke and Saltwater Madness. The days blurred into a cycle of relentless torture. The tropical sun hammered down, turning the open boats into floating ovens. Their skin blistered and peeled, and the salt spray rubbed their wounds raw. The constant bailing was the only thing that kept them afloat, a perpetual, exhausting reminder of the sea's power. The water rations vanished quickly. Thirst became the primary torture, driving men to hallucination. Their lips cracked, their tongues swelled, and their strength evaporated. Their clothes disintegrated, and they were left exposed, their sanity fraying under the dual pressure of starvation and the sun. On December 18, 1920, after nearly a month at sea, their first man died, Matthew Joy, the second mate, from dehydration and exposure. His death was the turning point, marking the moment they crossed the line from survivors to the condemned. The remaining men did the only thing they could do that was still moral. They recited a short service, weighted the body, and committed him to the deep, knowing that the loss of one man slightly extended the life of the rest. But the deaths began to accelerate. The tiny rations were now providing nothing more than the bare illusion of life. Their muscles atrophied, their voices became raspy whispers, and their eyes sunk into their skulls, giving them a hollow, skeletal appearance.
By early January 1821, the 3 boats had become separated in a storm. Chase's boat, now with only 4 men surviving, was alone. Pollard's boat and the 3rd boat, commanded by the 2nd surviving mate, Benjamin Lawrence, were still together. It was in Pollard's group that the final, darkest moral line was crossed. The men in the 2 remaining boats were now dying every few days. The survivors were too weak to row, too exhausted to speak. They had exhausted their food and water, having consumed everything leather, every piece of canvas, and finally the bones of the dead that they had previously buried. As 2 more men died of starvation in quick succession in Lawrence's boat, the survivors in both boats gathered in a grim consultation. They knew their fate was certain if they did not act. After a terrifying, desperate debate, they reached the ultimate, unspeakable pact: cannibalism. The body of the recently deceased was quickly stripped, cooked over a small fire lit on a flat stone, and consumed. The act, chronicled in the journals of the few who survived, was carried out with a terrible, silent solemnity, a necessary, disgusting transaction to buy another few days of life. Chapter 7. The Drawing of Lots. The horror intensified when no one else died. 4 men were left in Pollard's boat, all equally weak, all starving, all staring at one another. Captain Pollard, driven by an agonizing sense of duty to his men and his God, called for the final, ultimate surrender to the Pacific's cruelty. They would draw lots. The 4 remaining men agreed to the terrible rules. They would draw lots to determine who would be sacrificed. They would then draw lots to determine who would be the executioner. The lots were drawn,
The name pulled for death was Owen Coffin, the captain's 18-year-old cousin who had sailed with Pollard since childhood. Pollard was beside himself. He declared he would take Coffin's place, pleading with the other men to spare his kin. But Coffin, showing a courage that transcended the human horror, refused. "No," Coffin said, his voice barely a rasp. "I like my chance as well as any other." The second lot was drawn for the grim duty of executioner. It fell to Charles Ramsdell, Coffin's closest friend. Ramsdell wept, but bound by the terrible compact, he carried out the sentence. The murder was done. The cousin's body was consumed. This was the moment the captain and America would spend the next 2 decades trying to forget. 2 weeks later, another man died, and the 2 survivors, Pollard and Ramsdell, consumed him too. Part 4. The Rescue, the Trial, and the Orphan. Chapter 8. Found at the Edge of Life. After 94 days and over 4,500 miles of open boat drifting, the miracle happened. February 18, 1821, the first boat, commanded by Owen Chase, was spotted by the English brig Indian off the coast of Chile. Chase and the other 2 survivors were barely alive, skeletal shadows of men who could not stand and whose minds were barely tethered to reality. February 23, 1821, Pollard's boat, containing himself and Charles Ramsdell, was spotted by the Nantucket railer Dauphin. The sailors who found them were shocked. Pollard and Ramsdell were found huddled together, surrounded by the neatly picked bones of their shipmates, which they were using to keep track of their consumption. The captain was sucking on the marrow of a bone when they were rescued. Total survivors of the original 20 crewmen, only 8 survived. 6 were rescued in the 2 main boats, and 2 others who had split off earlier were later rescued, having survived only by landing briefly on an inhospitable island. Chapter 9. The Silence of Nantucket. The return journey was slow and agonizing. When the survivors arrived back on Nantucket, they were treated with a mixture of reverence, horror, and curiosity. The whaling elite, the shipowners, and the town elders understood the existential threat this story posed. The details of the lots, the murder of Owen Coffin, the captain's cousin, and the open cannibalism were too devastating to be allowed into the public discourse. They would spoil the myth of the heroic whaler and damage the reputation of the industry. The survivors were put on trial, but the purpose of the inquiry was not justice, it was damage control. The jury, comprised of fellow whalers and shipowners, ruled that the men's actions were committed out of extreme and irresistible necessity. No criminal charges were ever filed. The official verdict was a shameful, necessary lie. The voyage was a tragedy, but the crew's moral integrity remained intact. They paid the men their meager shares of the Essex's pre-sinking oil and told them, with an unspoken threat, to never speak of the lots or the cousin again. Chapter 10. The Unspoken Legacy. Owen Chase, pragmatic to the end, published a brief, horrifying account of the sinking and the subsequent ordeal that sold well and provided the only published evidence of the event. But Captain Pollard could never escape his moral debt. He took command of another whaler, which immediately struck a reef and sank. He returned to Nantucket and spent the rest of his life as the town's night watchman, a broken man who walked the streets in silent penance for the cousin he failed to save. When children asked him about his voyages, he would only ever tell them about the Essex being struck by a whale, always omitting the horror that followed. And yet the story did not truly die. In the 1840s, a young merchant sailor and aspiring novelist named Herman Melville heard the terrifying legend of the Essex from the son of one of the survivors. Melville recognized the profound moral and mythic power of the tale. The true unacknowledged legacy of the Essex was its primary foundational inspiration for Melville's 1851 masterpiece, Moby Dick. The story of the white whale destroying the ship was history, not fiction. The Essex was more than a shipwreck. It was a devastating indictment of human ambition, a story that America, built on the ideals of courage and piety, chose to silence. It remains the horrifying, unforgettable moral abyss at the heart of the sea, a story that reminds us of the terrible price of survival when men are pushed past the limits of God and civilization.
This story isn't just a dusty chapter from a history book. It's a mirror reflecting a side of our past we often choose to ignore. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other uncomfortable, astonishing truths about our history have we just let gather dust in the attic of our collective memory? Imagine what other forgotten ghost fleets are still sailing in the obscure corners of our national story, carrying the weight of past decisions. This isn't just about something that happened long ago. This is about understanding who we are today. Think about it. The story of Liberia, which we've just touched upon, is a powerful reminder that the world is an intricate web. Every single choice, whether it's made in the halls of Washington, D.C., or in the boardrooms of powerful corporations, sends an inescapable ripple across the globe, reaching the farthest shores. These aren't isolated events. They are interconnected threads in a much larger tapestry. When we ignore these connections, we miss the full picture. So, I challenge you, don't let this be the end of the story. Don't just accept the simplified version of history you were taught in school. Seek out these hidden histories, dig deeper, ask the uncomfortable questions, and demand the full, unvarnished truth. Because the most astonishing stories of tomorrow, the ones that will shape our future, are always hidden in the boring history of yesterday. The past is never really past, and understanding it is the key to building a better future. Thanks so much for watching and for being willing to explore these complex topics with me. If this video made you think, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that truly shaped our world. See you in the next one.